Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. Tonight we're examining the role played by the Western allies in the Ukraine conflict. We're asking, what will NATO do next? There's more destruction in and around Kyiv this Tuesday, so what will NATO do? It's a question many observers are asking. Most importantly, it's the only question people in Ukraine want answered, from the civilians under fire to the president in arms himself, Zelensky. The call's been the same for a no-fly zone. Well, this Tuesday, day 20 of the Russian invasion, Volodymyr Zelensky spoke again.
We hear a lot of conversations about the Third World War, that allegedly it could start if NATO will close the Ukrainian sky for Russian missiles and planes, and therefore the humanitarian no-fly zone was not yet established. That allows Russian army to bombard peaceful cities and blow up housing blocks and hospitals and schools. Of course, Ukraine is not the NATO member. We understand that. We are quite adequate regarding our understanding. We have heard for many years about the open doors, but we also heard that we can't enter those doors. And this is truth, and we have simply to accept it as it is.
Volodymyr Zelensky speaking a little earlier. The no-fly zone, then so far NATO has refused point blank. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg speaking for the alliance in that flat refusal to close the sky over Ukraine. And now with a Russian airstrike just 60 kilometres from the border of Poland, a NATO state, let's not forget, the hypothetical question becomes all the more real. Will NATO ever strike back? Let's listen to Jens Stoltenberg speaking a little earlier.
They are making absurd claims about biological labs and chemical weapons in Ukraine. This is just another lie. And we are concerned that Moscow could stage a false flag operation, possibly including chemical weapons. When we see more military activities, when we see actually fighting going on close to NATO borders, there is always a risk for incidents and accidents. And therefore we have to make every effort to prevent such incidents and accidents, and if they happen, to make sure that they don't spiral out of control and create really dangerous situations.
Jens Stoltenberg of NATO there. What then of the civilians who are being targeted by Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine? Who is there to protect them? Yes, arms have been supplied by the US, the UK, via Poland, NATO states once again. But this isn't stopping the Russian bombardment. We know NATO leaders are set to meet in Brussels for a joint summit with their EU counterparts on March the 24th. But that's in 9 days' time, and a lot can happen between now and then. Our panel to discuss NATO's evolving role in the Ukraine crisis, a crisis where civilians are being killed by Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. Our panel then, let's introduce them to you. Here in the studio is General Jean-Paul Paloméros, former Air Force Chief Commander of NATO Allied Forces. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Pleasure to meet you. Joining us by Skype from Kyiv, we've got Sergei Vlasenko, a member of the Ukraine Parliament. Sergei, thank you for being with us. Also by Skype from Kyiv, in a different part of the city, Peter Zalmayev, Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Peter, thanks for joining us. And in studio from Washington, thank you, sir. And studio in Washington, we have Melinda Herring, Deputy Director, Senior Fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute at the Eurasia Centre at the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much, Melinda, for being with us. You were the last to introduce, but I'm starting with you, if that's okay. Melinda, in terms of what we're seeing and hearing, what is your reading of the situation right now? Obviously, we have Volodymyr Zelensky saying not enough is being done. The world is actually being silent. On the other hand, we hear from the likes of Jens Stoltenberg that a lot is being done, or that's the limit to what they can do. What is your interpretation of what is happening now?
Zelensky is exactly right. The world is being too timid. NATO is being too timid, and Washington is being too timid. What happened last week looks ridiculous, and Vladimir Putin is laughing. The MiGs, the old Soviet jets in Poland, should have been transferred already. The White House blinked, and it shouldn't have. The White House claimed that it was logistically complicated to move about 30 jets from Poland to Ukraine. That's nonsense. It's easy. It's less than an hour in the air. It is not logistically complicated. The White House also claimed that there was no strategic rationale. There's every strategic rationale. Thousands of civilians, innocent civilians, especially in Mariupol, are being killed. How many people have to die before the White House finds a strategic rationale to do the right thing?
Melinda, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in our voices in Kyiv, starting with the MP there, member of the Ukraine Parliament, Sergei Vlasenko. Sergei, thanks for being with us. Give us a sense of what things are like where you are. I mean, clearly today we've heard there have been airstrikes on Kyiv, a curfew's imposed, at least 4 people killed. Give us a sense of how things are where you are.
Yes, you see, you are absolutely right. You totally rightly described the situation in Kyiv. So every day and every night we have the missiles just bombing our capital of the country. We have civilian people died, and yes, we have NATO giving no flying zone to Ukraine. Yes, our military are doing very well. They are very strong on earth, but yes, we have some problems in the air, and we need the help from the European community and the world community in the sky. And I'm always saying, when you are establishing a no-fly zone, you are protecting not only Ukraine, you are protecting yourselves. Because if something will happen, for example, with the Chernobyl nuclear plant station or with the Zaporizhia nuclear plant station, the problem will be not only in Ukraine, the problem will be all over Europe and even all over the world. And when the NATO is saying, yes, we are not going to start any military action against Russian Federation, I'm saying, okay, do not start a military action. Please start a humanitarian action. Please make a no-fly zone, for example, over the nuclear plant stations in Ukraine and over the humanitarian corridors. So that's the sense of the question. And the total no-fly zone could be established by the coalition of the willing of the countries who are ready to do that, or that could be done under the umbrella of the UN mandate. So United Nations could make that decision, and NATO could implement that decision as an organization which is implementing the decision of the UN. So the history knows such an examples, and that should be done. Because I will end with what I begin. So the civilians are dying every day. Every day, the civilian people are dying every day. Yes, Ukrainian military are very strong on earth, but we need some help in the air.
Sergei, we'll get back to you very shortly. Sergei Vlasenko, member of the Ukraine Parliament. Our next guest from Kyiv, Peter Zalmayev, director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Peter, thanks for being with us. Sure. I know you've got many things to say, and I'll start by asking you, just for an opener, to give us a sense of where you are, what you're hearing, what you're seeing, and the kind of things you're encountering day to day in Kyiv.
Well, what I'm encountering is obviously an incredible kind of incredible fighting spirit on the part of Kyivans, on the part of Ukrainians at large. I have traveled actually outside of Kyiv for the last 2 weeks. I've traveled the length and breadth of the country, and the sort of the rise in national consciousness that I'm seeing has not been witnessed in this country since the 1940s. The kind of war Ukraine is waging now, the only precedent we have for it, once again, is World War II. It's a war where there are no more shades of gray. It's black and white. We have nowhere to go but 6 feet underground. This is our land. We're fighting for our land. And so since the NATO was an expansion of NATO policy vis-a-vis Russia is our topic today, I will just proffer my thought that, from the beginning, it was never about NATO. NATO expansion is a red herring that Vladimir Putin has used to prosecute his war of 19th century style war of subjugation and conquest. There's almost a genetical dislike that the Russians, have for Ukrainians. They consider Ukrainians their lesser brothers. They do not believe Ukraine, has the right to exist as an independent state. So we're witnessing a war of annihilation. There've been, the accusation. There's been an accusation of genocide being committed against Ukrainians, bandied about, and I know it's a very strict term. But I've spoken with legal experts, both in Ukraine and outside, and they are saying that what they're seeing right now on the ground, just to back up what Mr. Vlasenko was saying, our MP, what you're seeing in Mariupol, which is only 1 hour away from my hometown of Donetsk, actually comes very close to the definition. And tomorrow we're expecting an intermediary decision by the International Criminal Court, which has taken up Ukraine's complaint, and it's reviewing the issue of war crimes being committed against our citizens. So once again, I'll just say what we're seeing is a war of annihilation. Vladimir Putin is hell-bent.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. Technical team, please try and sort out the sound with Peter there because he broke up at the end. I don't know whether you caught that. And obviously we'd like to hear exactly what Peter Zalmayev has to say. Just to recap at the end before I bring you in, General Palomeros here in the studio. Peter, they're referring to the International Criminal Court pre-investigation, which has been launched already from The Hague in order to look at the possibility of war crimes being committed. And of course, parallel to that, there's an investigation launched by Germany into similar situations. And obviously, Vladimir Putin's role and the role of the troops on the ground will be examined. Let's bring in our guest here in the studio, General Jean-Paul Palomeros, former Air Force Chief Commander of NATO Allied Forces. General Palomeros, you're not here to defend NATO because obviously, you're not there anymore. But if we can get an idea from yourself as to what the thinking is, why NATO perhaps isn't giving the likes of Peter and Sergei what they're asking for.
Well, that's a terrible question, issue, and as a military, as a commander, I fully understand all what's said before, because I feel really terribly sorry for all these people who are suffering in Ukraine, and I know as well that the air superiority is a key asset in such circumstances. This is why it's so important as well that we deliver as much and as soon as possible air defense weapons, which are very effective, by the way, and the Ukrainians are using that. First and foremost, NATO has done, and I was there in 2014, we have done a lot of work with Ukrainians to train them and to integrate them in a partnership to make sure that they are able to improve their military capacity, and it worked very well. They are very good in doing that, and they are able to use as well all the weapons that we deliver for their best effect. Now speaking, going to the bulk of the question, it is sure that NATO is defensive by essence, we know, and the Ukrainians, unfortunately, are on the wrong side of the border of NATO. To speak frankly, nothing precludes any NATO member to decide by itself if he wants to intervene. But there is a price to pay. The price to pay is the high risk of escalation. And so far, and I fully understand that, unfortunately, there is no choice. I mean, NATO cannot take the risks, and any ally so far didn't take the risk of escalating with Putin. And this is, as I said, a terrible situation that we have in hands. It would need, that was said as well, for NATO to intervene in a UN Security Council resolution. And we know that it won't happen with Russia and China on board. And Russia is a belligerent. So unfortunately, I think there is no way out of that, and the pressure will keep on rising, for sure. What the NATO leaders will do, this is for them to say, but this is the situation as it is today. It can be revised, obviously, but I don't see NATO moving like that because they don't want to take the responsibility of any escalation.
We've mentioned military aid, General, going into Ukraine via Poland, via certain NATO states, US, the UK, to name but two. When you hear the Russians saying that these aid convoys, these military supply convoys, could well be the subject of military strikes by them, and then you hear Jens Stoltenberg saying basically there's nothing we can do. How does that make you feel?
Well, as I told you, as a soldier, as a commander, I've been involved in many operations in Bosnia and many other places. We feel terribly, not sorry, but discouraged by that because we would like to do something. I would like to help these people. I would like to fly for them. But we are part of an alliance. There are rules. Unfortunately, Ukraine doesn't belong to, and the United Security Council is blocked. What to say?
General, thank you for the moment. Thank you very much indeed, General Jean-Paul Palameros, formerly a high-ranking general in the NATO forces. Let's bring in Melinda, who I noticed nodding during a number of things that the General had to say. Melinda, can I ask you about sort of listening to the words of Jens Stoltenberg, for instance, speaking earlier today? It must, given what you've said to us already, you must be very discouraged by what the Secretary-General of NATO had to say.
Yeah, Mark, I'm not very encouraged at all, but I hear the general and I hear his sympathy and I share it. But I think that the world and the West have to do a lot better. I think we owe it to the Ukrainian people. I think it's insufficient just to put more troops, more NATO troops in Eastern Europe, which is likely to happen next week, and to issue more sympathetic statements. We can do better than that. I think it's possible, and we should be having discussions about a limited no-fly zone. You can put it in Western Ukraine, and it is not dangerous. We need to be wise, and I understand that everyone is worried about Russian escalation, but we've done this before. We've done this in Syria. We can do it again without risking World War III. So,
like you say, these kind of measures have been taken in Syria. They've been taken before in other conflicts. The question is, why can't it happen now? That's the question you're basically asking.
Yeah, that's exactly. I'm still looking for a good answer, honestly. The only answer in town in Washington is that if there's a limited no-fly zone, not even a full no-fly zone, just a limited one in Western Ukraine for humanitarian reasons, that automatically translates into World War III. That's false. That's absolutely false. It's a canard.
And of course, Melinda, we've seen that area that you've just spoken of and referred to, the west of Ukraine. We've heard from our correspondent there the impact of what happened on the strike 24 hours ago on the TV tower. About 20 people, maybe more, killed. And it raises the question once again, how many more people have to die before action is taken, Melinda?
That's exactly right. So Vladimir Putin, I don't think in my best judgment, Mark, that he's going to try to take on NATO. I don't think he's going to hit Poland. I don't think he's going to hit the Baltic states. I understand why those NATO members are very nervous, but Vladimir Putin is having a hard time in Ukraine. He doesn't want to take NATO on too. I think his behavior is unstable and he's not acting like he has been in the past. He's always been a cautious risk taker, but Ukraine, what he did in Ukraine, those actions are not those of a cautious risk taker. So I understand why they're nervous, but he's not going to go after NATO. He knows that he will get his butt kicked. So it is time for the West to stand up with resolve and certainty and put a limited no-fly zone into Western Ukraine and be measured and careful about it and tell the Russians what we're doing.
Melinda, thank you very much for now. Let's go back to Kyiv, to our two guests there, Sergei Vlaslenko, the MP, Vlasenko, excuse me, Sergei, and Peter Zalmayev from the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Starting with you, Sergei. In terms of what you're seeing and what you've been hearing round this table and in this debate, does it leave you with any sense that anything is going to develop? I mean, clearly Jens Stoltenberg's words earlier on from NATO was that clearly NATO is not going to advance anywhere near towards the kind of measure that you want.
I will tell you, you see, I think, you see, if Putin will not be beaten in Ukraine, I know the result. The result will be impunity.
Good.
There was impunity during his invasion to Moldova when the Transnistria region appeared. After that, there was impunity for Putin when he invaded in Georgia in 2008. Now, Putin is, as a result of that impunity, Putin invaded to Ukraine. If here he will not be beaten, the next step will be Poland and Baltic states, for sure. If Putin will receive no answer, no adequate answer, I mean military answer from NATO, Putin will make his next step. Because Putin's goal is not the Ukraine. Putin's goal is to destroy the European and the world order. That's the first issue. And the second issue is he wants to recreate all that Soviet Union and all that, let's say, socialist bloc, having there on board Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and other former Soviet republics. That's his real goal. So if he will not be beaten here in Ukraine, he will make a new step. So here in Ukraine, we are not fighting only for Ukraine. We are fighting for the European future. And the people of the European Union should understand that. And the NATO generals should understand that. Because the impunity, that's the worst situation for such a person like Mr. Putin is. When there is impunity, he is making a next step, and next step, and next step, and he will never stop, because the history shows us that he is not stopping. And you should understand that, and the NATO generals should understand that. They are saying we don't want the escalation, but the escalation is going on every day, every day. Yes, today on the territory of Ukraine, but tomorrow it could be done in the territory of Poland, or Lithuanian Republic, or other Baltic states. So you should understand that, and you should deal with that. You should live with that, and you should make your decision based on that issue. And as Ukraine, I will say it once more. Yes, we need a no-fly zone. We need an air defense weapons. We need the airplanes just to block all that Putin's attempt to ruin the world stability and the European stability.
Sergei, for now, thank you very much indeed. Before I bring in Peter, can I just bring in the General here in the studio? General Palomeros, we heard that Sergei Vlasenko, an MP in Kyiv, talking about Vladimir Putin having this grand plan to reconstruct the Soviet Empire. Putin, of course, it's all on record, said it was an absolute travesty, a disaster that the Soviet Union ever broke up. Do you interpret it that way?
Yeah. I think Putin is trying to pull another curtain, iron curtain on his word, and nobody knows so far where it will stop. And this is the question, unfortunately, with Ukraine. Should Ukraine come under this new part of the new Russia, if I may say so, and then be submitted to this new Cold War? And that will be really a nightmare and a pity. I would agree with that.
General Palomeros, thank you very much indeed. Let's go back to the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative in Kyiv, Peter Zalmayev. Peter, thanks for bearing with us. I had to get a comment there from the General on that one. I'm sure you understand. In terms of what we've been seeing, what Putin's doing now, this has been really a long time in the making, hasn't it? It's been something that's been developing a long time. And you said you're a native of Donetsk. You must have been aware of these things a lot longer than perhaps we have been aware of these things.
Yeah, I mean, you should have been. I mean, we should all have been reading signs, sort of, on and they have been, provided to us throughout. In 2003, when he was meeting his counterpart George W. Bush, he is reported to have said, "George, forget about Ukraine. Ukraine is not even a country." Then he went on to say that he considered the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. Then in 2004, the first Maidan. Vladimir Putin sent his goons to eastern Ukraine, to Donetsk, my area, to stir up these early sort of, movements, separatist movements there, which failed quite quickly, but still. And obviously, don't forget who poisoned Mr. Yushchenko, the Ukrainian president. So, and then 2014 comes around, and the obvious, war of aggression against Ukraine, Crimea, then the Donbass. And so, yes, we have seen this escalation, this escalatory logic to his actions. And now it seems a lot of people are questioning whether Vladimir Putin is rational, because, albeit what you're seeing, like I said, is logical, this sort of escalation that we're seeing. On the other hand, it is, by all accounts, quite destructive, not only to Ukraine, but I think it is destructive, first of all, to Russia. I just do not see any rational explanation how and in which world this benefits Russia. Russia is relying on China's help in this. It is all clear. If we talk about any kind of diplomatic breakthrough, it is in China's, power to do so. But I think China is just sitting there and watching, and is very happy seeing Russia destroying its military potential, destroying its reputation, its economy, so that it can just basically take over Russia, demand a very high price for its natural resources, etc. Vladimir Putin has basically pawned the future of his people. This is what we're seeing. It's a very tragic situation. He's dragging all of us down, but once again, he's dragging his own people down.
It's an interesting point, Peter, that everyone else's misfortune can be China's gain, and it's something that many people are referring to, the fact that it's an opportunity for China to exploit many different aspects of what's happening on the world agenda right now. Peter, can I just stay with you and ask you a little bit more about Donetsk, about your part of the world,
Sure.
where you grew up? We hear that there are Russian separatists. In your opinion, how much of that is about people who genuinely want to be Russian and people who are under pressure to take that line?
Well, listen, from the get-go, from 2014, there were a few diehards and a few people there, sort of the sleeper cells of the Russian world, Ruski Mir, as it's called, who actually came out of the ground and led this movement. But most of it came from Russia, obviously. You know, there was never an appetite, even in the Russian-speaking Donetsk. And like I grew up a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, there was never an appetite for separatism. There was never an appetite for joining Mother Russia. You know, it was a fake story from the very beginning. According to polls in 2014, only 30,000 people wanted to separate from Ukraine and join Russia. And so as a result, what you saw was a huge influx of obviously arms, but also fighters and provocateurs who started to run these so-called stateless Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic, and this is what they're trying to do now in Kherson. You're seeing and in Berdyansk, these towns on the southern fringes of the country, and they're not succeeding there at all. In the last 8 years, what you had is a strengthening of the Ukrainian national idea, a Ukrainian statehood. So despite these worst sort of KGB tactics they're trying to apply to Kherson, every day you're seeing pro-Ukrainian demonstrations, and people will not be cowed. We're hearing that FSB, which is the KG successor to the KGB, is considering public executions to try to bring some sort of control over the population. People, I mean, you've never seen this sort of rise of national consciousness as now. And this speaks to this gross and incredible failure on the part of Russia's security agencies and its spies to really figure out what Ukrainians are about. They expected a different sort of welcome, and they got a very rude awakening.
Peter Zalmayev, Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, thank you for the moment very much indeed.
Thank
Peter
you.
in Kyiv, Sergei Vlasenko in Kyiv too, General Palomeros here in the studio. Let's go now to Washington. Melinda Herring there of the Atlantic Council. She's a Foreign Policy Research Institute Senior Fellow at the Eurasia Center. Melinda, we always appreciate your analysis when you join us. And I'm wondering about, having listened to what Peter's been saying, how important to what the Russians are trying to do is this kind of infiltration that's been going on?
I think Peter nailed it, honestly. I don't think anyone can do better. So since 2014, there has been this growing civic identity in Ukraine. And Peter's right that that identity is really growing and it's expanded. And Ukraine is no longer divided between East-West religions or anything else. It's a civic identity that binds everyone together. And Putin, this war since the 24th of February shows us is that the Kremlin does not understand Ukraine. It does not understand how much it's changed. It doesn't understand its aspirations. I think that there's a lot of mistakes that were made on the Russian side, but this is the chief one. It is, if Vladimir Putin had read a newspaper, he would have known that he was going to get his butt kicked in Kyiv. There was a poll from the Razumkov Center that was done before the war started, and it found that 45% of Ukrainians would fight and resist. So, if he'd bothered to do a little bit more research and really truly try to understand modern Ukraine since it's changed since 2014, I think he would have made a different decision.
He doesn't understand Ukraine, Melinda. Is the issue that he actually understands NATO? He understands that really he's got NATO where he wants them. NATO won't really act in any way, and he can basically do what he wishes.
That's a really shrewd point. I think you're right. Vladimir Putin understands the West. He understands the limitations, and he's still in the catbird seat. Everyone is praising the Ukrainians for their heroic fighting, and they deserve it, and they deserve more. And the resistance is incredibly courageous. But Vladimir Putin, I'm really concerned about Mariupol, and people are calling it sort of the Aleppo tactics. So if you look at Mariupol, there's a humanitarian catastrophe underway, and I think that's the model. I think that's what Vladimir Putin is going to do in Kharkiv and Kyiv. And they're just going to cut everyone off from food, power, water, and just bomb indiscriminately until Ukraine bends its knee. I think that's the plan, and Vladimir Putin knows he can get away with it. We're still going to be arguing about no-fly zones and the next round of sanctions.
Drinking water cut off to Mariupol. Essential supplies blocked getting into Mariupol. Sergei Vlasenko, can I bring you back in, our MP in Kyiv? The situation there, Melinda's saying this could be a situation replicated in Kharkiv, Kherson, other places around Ukraine. You must have a real sense that this could be, for your people, for the people that you know, for people in different parts of the country that you know, a terribly, a life-threatening period right now.
Yes, absolutely. You are right. So that's a life-threatening period. And we have a very big humanitarian catastrophes in the eastern part of Ukraine. I mean, in Mariupol, in Chernihiv, the same situation. The city is totally captured. It is surrounded. It's not captured. It is surrounded by the Russian troops, and the people have the problems with the food. The people have the problems with the water. The people are living in the bomb shelters, in the basements. People are not living in their apartments for dozens of the days. So we have these small, let's say, suburban cities near Kyiv, like Bucha or Irpin. So the same catastrophe we have. So we have every day the people trying to escape from there, and we have no possibility to have enough humanitarian corridors, because yes, some corridors are announced, but not all the people who want to escape through that corridors could use them because of different reasons. Especially when the Russia is starting just using their artillery against and missiles against that humanitarian corridors. So that's why I'm just trying to say once more, we need a no-flying zone at least over the humanitarian corridors and the nuclear power stations. So these are two very painful points that we need to be supported by the Air Force of different countries, of different organizations like NATO, different alliances like NATO. Yes, to help our people to escape from that humanitarian catastrophe areas. We need to have a no-fly zone at least over that areas to allow people to go, not to see the airplanes and the missiles flying over them trying to escape. So that's the biggest problem. And I think that you raised a very, very strict and very nice question. How many Ukrainians should die for NATO to decide? And by the way, with all my due respect to NATO as to organization, to their statutory documents, but Putin knows one more thing. Putin knows bureaucracy. Putin knows the European bureaucracy. Putin knows how the NATO bureaucracy works. Yes, NATO was established at the end of the 40s, so 70 years ago, the world changed. So we need to have a modern decision-making process in the organizations like NATO, and they should react. I mean, the UN also had to react, because if the main goal of the UN is to protect peace, and we have no decisions, I mean, effective decisions on the Russian-Ukrainian war, that's the question. That's the question. Is that organization effective or not?
Sergei, thank you very much indeed. Let me bring in the General here in the studio, General Jean-Paul Parameros, former Air Force Chief Commander of NATO Allied Forces. General, and it's not to you to bring the solutions here, because you don't represent the whole of NATO, but you give us an insight into what people think in NATO and what the thought process is, and we appreciate that. We have a situation, we've just been talking about Mariupol, where people are surrounded, and the Russians are actually concocting it in such a way that aid can't get in, basically bombing the routes in, so they can't get that stuff in. Kyiv is almost under siege, with all the areas around the capital being bombed. Residential areas, people are being killed, losing their lives. And I know as a soldier, your instinct is probably to get in there and sort these things out. But from a NATO perspective, that isn't going to happen. I'll come back to the old question. How far does it have to go? Will there be a point when NATO says, yes, we have to intervene?
You know, NATO is an alliance of 30 countries today. Very soon, the NATO leaders, they meet. They will have to reassess perhaps the risk. Nothing is written forever. There is a pressure. But I would like to come back on what was said before, because no, NATO is not a bureaucracy. It's a really operationally oriented organization. And it is not, we must not confuse the fact that NATO cannot, and say it cannot, it decided not to intervene because of the risk of escalation and the effectiveness of NATO. I can tell you, if any single aircraft, any single missile, any single man, a soldier, cross the border to any NATO member, that will be hit.
But isn't there a point, General, that NATO has to, and maybe it's the role that the United States used to take independently. I'm not sure, perhaps you can explore this for me, but isn't there a point where someone has to say, we are the world policeman, we will go in there and stop this?
Well, NATO doesn't recognize itself as the world policeman, but the situation is very unique. I mean, we never thought after the Second World War and the Cold War that we will face a situation where a major power, a huge power, will attack straightforward his neighbor, a democratic and a full country on its own right. So, and this is perhaps the question that is raised now, because we never imagined it could happen, really. We were facing a Cold War approach where any single member of NATO was protected by NATO, and I do say that it is the case, with absolutely no doubt. But what to do if we have sometimes to speak of that between 2014 and now, but it happened that the Ukraine joining NATO, even if it could have happened, was stopped by the fact that Putin attacked Ukraine and split in a certain way Ukraine. So NATO couldn't even if we wished, integrate Ukraine in NATO because of that, because it cannot integrate a nation which is divided in a certain way, because there is a risk, and the Article 5 would apply exactly as Mr. Putin knows that very well. He's playing with that. I do agree. But, you know, a new situation, leaders will consider, I doubt that they will intervene, but never say never. I mean, the pressure is there, but I would say as well, in conclusion, that enforcing a no-fly zone on a very small area doesn't work. It's not like that in the air. Everything is fast. The lengths are different in the air, and so you enforce a no-fly zone on a certain area. Could be the west, could be. But you cannot enforce on a specific point. It doesn't work because the missiles are shot a long way, far away, and so it will not be effective.
An airstrike could come from an aircraft flying over Russian soil, for instance, couldn't it? I think that's the possibility. General, thank you very much for being with us. Let's bring in for a final comment, because time is now against us. Peter Zalmayev, of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative there in Kyiv, native of Donetsk. You've explained to us the situation where you are. You've explained the situation where you grew up. What kind of a country do you hope there will be by the end of this? Do you think there is a way out that will give you the Ukraine that you want?
Well, you know, it's a very good question. You know, from day to day, we sort of wake up with this foreboding and hoping against hope that's all been a bad dream. And then the moments complete despondency. But at the same time, they're mixed in with moments of elation that Ukraine, contrary to what to Russia, for example, and I think it's facing very bleak prospects. But I think Ukraine shall overcome, shall withstand adversity, and I have no doubt in my mind that it has a very, very bright future. The EU has agreed in principle to accept Ukraine as a member. The Ukraine has shown this unprecedented rise of national consciousness, civic, as Melinda said, civic identity. It's the strongest ever. It has the sympathy of the world, and I think that this is exactly when nations are formed, in Ukraine is is like steel being forged in front of our eyes. So I'm very, very optimistic.
It is a very strong image for what is an extremely difficult, the worst of times perhaps for many people. Peter Zalmayev, Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, thank you, sir, for being with us. Thanks to our other guests, Sergei Vlasenko, member of the Ukraine Parliament. Thank you, Sergei, for joining us. Thanks to Melinda Herring, Deputy Director, Senior Fellow, the Foreign Policy Research Institute at the Eurasia Centre Atlantic Council. Thank you, Melinda. And thanks to General Jean-Paul Palomeros, former Air Force Chief Commander of NATO Allied Forces, for joining us here in the studio. Thank you for your insight, sir. We greatly appreciate it. Thanks to you for watching, of course. Our continued coverage of events in Ukraine continues here on France 24. Stay with us.